Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our discussion of a lot of stuff. All right, so we are now currently in the midst of talking about a very large, intricate, intense, multi-thematic unit, okay? We are now currently talking about the massive cultural shift in Europe that is going to occur from the 17th century to the 18th century, right? AKA from the 1600s to the 1700s, right? So we spent a lot of time today in class reviewing, going over the agricultural revolution, talking about how that's going to affect people differently, discussing how Avery, is very, very proud of, Under the Big Top because she thinks it's better than the Sanger. You know what I mean? So a lot of other really, really big stuff like that. So the thing you need to understand, though, getting into it, is we're now going to kind of be starting to pivot a little bit, right? We're going to start pivoting a little bit away from the agricultural revolution, away from the putting out system, the cottage industry, and all that stuff. And what we're going to start discussing is, how is that going to affect other facets? What's going on in the cities? What's happening out, everywhere else? What's going on in the colonies, right? What's going on in all these other areas that are affected by European influence, okay? So the big thing that we got to start off with is the fact that something is dying. And no, I don't mean Mardi Gras. This is not like a crew or anything like that, even though it looks suspiciously like a parade at Mardi Gras, right? So the big thing about it, though, is no, that right there is an urban guild, all right? So something that you need to understand is urban guild and guilds in general, they're all the same thing, okay? The guilds that we talked about going into the Renaissance that were there that made tons and tons of money as merchant and craft guilds and stuff like that were coming out of Europe during the 1300s, late 1200s, and the late Middle Ages, okay? So when we were talking about those things, they were still very much a thing, in the 1600s, right? They very much existed. They actually had these really large parades every single year where they would commemorate the new year and then also the granting of the monopolies and things like that. But the thing about it, though, is, they're still there. Remember those guilds, right? Still around. But the thing about it is just like the open field system, the guilds are also becoming very inefficient, right? The guilds are becoming super inefficient because the rural industries are beginning to undermine them, okay? So to give you a kind of an idea of what we're getting at here, we have the putting out system. We have the cottage industry now that's now making and manufacturing textiles at a much cheaper rate than the guilds could ever do it at, right? And some of you are like, well, were the guilds really in charge of making cloth and textiles? Yes, they were the most profitable, some of the most profitable out of all the guilds were textile guilds, right? The Wool Merchants Guild of Florence paid for Brunelleschi's dome, y'all, in Florence. Mackenzie, when she did her report and stuff like that on Brunelleschi's dome, that dome was paid for by a textile guild, right? So the thing you need to understand, though, is now that other people in the countryside are making, cheaper textiles, the guilds are beginning to lose some money, right? And the thing about it, though, too, is, the guilds are kind of outdated, right? They had a lot of problems compared to the putting out system, okay? For example, they set their own price. They're making all of the money and not distributing it out into the economy anywhere. And also, they basically effectively having a monopoly on certain products, right? And so the thing about it is that the guilds were stifling economic growth, so they're going to begin to die, right? And they kind of needed to die. Guilds were also very expensive and also restricted female workers. They also restricted other religions and foreigners and other people and were very exclusive to their actually intake of new people. So the thing about it it wasn't some people always ask me, they're like, well, aren't guilds early versions of corporations and commercialism? Well, yeah, but imagine if certain items were super. Here's a great example. You want to know what the best example of a guild is in the modern era? Cable companies and internet providers, okay? Cox could be considered a guild, right? Because due to the fact that they can maybe the only one that actually provides a service to your area. So they have a monopoly on internet in your area, right? Why is this frustrating? Because it's restrictive. It's difficult. They may restrict certain people from actually being able to access it. They might not have good coverage in other places, right? It's not very effective. That's not free market capitalism. That's kind of a sketchy thing. And what needs to happen is competition needs to rise up, okay? For any of y'all that are wait, the invisible hand of competition, right, Rowan? So we're going to talk about Adam Smith again here in a second, right? The guilds are eventually going to be dissolved because they're just inefficient. And I'm not saying that your internet provider is inefficient. I'm just saying the idea of internet coverage is only being limited to a few companies is pretty inefficient, right? Kind of like the guilds and stuff like that. So guilds were eventually dissolved in 1791. In France in particular, and many countries are going to begin to follow suit after this, okay? Many believe that they slowed economics, and they also slowed down technological progression. They also believe that they affected political advancement, right? And so the big thing about it, though, is that guilds are just dying out, y'all. And we're now moving into what Adam Smith called a free market, economically liberal system, okay? So the thing you need to understand really quick about this word right here, liberal, right? Liberal or liberalism. What we're getting at with that is more the idea of the advocacy for change and the advocacy for free movement, okay? So the thing about it, though, you have to understand is that, like, the guilds would have at the time been considered, like, conservative, okay? Conservative to the extent that they had been around for several hundred years, and they were, like, the status quo. Well, the banishment of the guilds is going to lead to this concept called economic liberalism, where this idea was pioneered by Adam Smith in his book known as The Wealth of Nations, right? And remember, the Wealth of Nations is very important because we've got naming capitalism. We have free market competition, free markets in general. We have laissez-faire economics, which we'll talk about that here in a second. But the number one thing about it, though, is economic liberalism, economic liberalism, and Adam Smith and everything in his book of The Wealth of Nations really looked down on the mercantile systems that had come before them, right? And mercantilism, remember, was the entire thing where the countries were trying to hoard as much money as they possibly could to themselves. They didn't want to, like, trade or move any other products in or out of certain countries, right? They didn't want to buy any other foreign goods, so they slapped tariffs on top of them all the time. Well, Adam Smith looked at mercantilism and guilds in the same light. He's like, you're restricting the growth of the economy. You're restricting competition. You're restricting us from making more money. He said that states that provide a free trade system and competition would benefit all people. Rich people would benefit, poor people would benefit. And here's the thing, y'all, he's not wrong. Like, look at the lives of the poor in the western part of Europe. Were they still awful? Yes. Were they still unfair? Yes. Were they still in need of political reform? 110%. But were they also living in less famine? Well, yeah. Were they also, like, making products faster? Well, yeah. Were they also leading to a consumer revolution at this point? Yeah. So advancement is slow, and their rights need to be recognized. Like, all human rights need to be recognized. But Adam Smith is right. Like, the ideas of competition and free market societies are benefiting all people, of all classes by this point, right? And so the thing you need to understand as well is that according to Adam Smith, trade has to remain free, okay? And this is what we call a free market, right? Free market means that businesses have the ability to start, live, and die on their own, right? You can't sit there and coordinate with them and stuff like that. Like, for example, Adam Smith would have heavily looked down on the English East India Company, right? He doesn't like the idea that there's only one company bringing in foreign goods from certain areas like India, right? He also doesn't like the idea that there are certain importers and exporters going to and from the colonies, right? According to Smith, you got to keep it all, like, fair and free, right? Free market. Like, if Reagan wants to start a business where she makes funny t-shirts, like she paused or flipped to be here or whatever, she has to be allowed to do that according to according to Adam Smith, because that is a free market. And so the thing about it is what is Adam Smith trying to get away from? Laissez-faire economics, right? He didn't like the idea that there was, under absolutist and mercantilism reigns of monarchs and stuff like that, that they could go up to somebody like Reagan and say, no, don't make your t-shirts because they actually don't benefit anybody. Well, it benefits Reagan, and then it benefits some other person when Delilah opens her t-shirt business, and she's like, I'm got to compete with Reagan. I got to either make my stuff more expensive and higher quality, or I got to make it cheaper to increase demand, right? So the thing about it is all of that is free market ideas, right? Laissez-faire economics is when a government is taxing too heavily or trying to tell certain producers who they can and can't sell to, right? Laissez-faire is government intervention, okay? So the thing about it is Adam Smith said you got to stop doing that, right? You got to stop doing that because free markets will benefit everybody. He said the only thing that a government should worry about is taxation for providing defense, sponsoring public works like sewage and drainage and canals and, like, roadways and stuff like that, serve judicially, as in enforce laws and, actually punish offenders. And then also he was strongly against mercantilism, right? Because literally laissez-faire economics is mercantilism, right? Now, don't write this next thing I'm going to put, but it is very important for us to understand. So some people always ask, well, would Adam Smith, the writer of The Wealth of Nations, our Scottish Enlightenment thinker, would he be happy with, Jean-Baptiste Colbert? Oh, God, no. Well, would he be happy with modern economics? Not so much, actually. Also weird, which is really, really weird. Adam Smith actually would not like modern economics very much at all. He liked the idea of wage increases. He liked the idea of like continually upping the amount that people got paid to produce things and stuff like that. And like wages have been kind of stagnant for like several decades now. He also hated the idea of division of labor, right? He didn't like the putting out system because he knew what was happening is merchants were taking advantage of rural poor and to actually trying to basically use them like a factory, because division of labor means that like you're not making it yourself and then selling it, you're depending on cheap labor to make it and sell it at a cheaper price, and that's not true competition, right? And also, especially don't write this, he did say this as well: no society can surely be flourishing and happy, or which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So the big thing about it is, too, is Adam Smith believed that capitalism should kind of eradicate the problem of poverty, right? Even though it was still persisting at the time. So economic liberalism and Adam Smith's ideas are good, and it gives us things that we like now. Like this sweater that I'm wearing right now is a product of economic liberalism because it's from Banana Republic, and I like it a lot. But the thing about it is, I could have gone to J. Crew and bought a sweater. That's economic liberalism, right? It's good, but Adam Smith would still not like it currently, right? So the other thing that you got to understand about is what about the global economy, right? So like Adam Smith's ideas really kind of honed in and were laser focused on why the guilds needed to die, right? Like Adam Smith would have been so happy with the guilds dying out. He was like, you're creating monopolies, you're restricting labor, you're doing all this other stuff. That's annoying, right? So like the thing that you need to understand though is that the global economy is very different from local economy. When we're talking about like people in a city and in a village and the way their economics works very differently from the giant war and feud that's about to be going on between Great Britain, France, and the Dutch, all right? So, like, the thing about it is that you got to understand these three countries right here are expanding rapidly, growing rapidly, getting aggressively large and beginning to influence the global economy on a massive, massive level, okay? Now, really quickly, why do I have a star next to Great Britain? Two reasons why I have a star next to Great Britain. One, as of the 1800s, as of, hold on, I gotta look this up real quick. So I can never remember if it's the United Kingdom or Great Britain, but I think it's Great Britain. It's under Queen Anne, right? So when did it become Great Britain? So 1707. I knew I was on like off by a little bit, right? So in 1707, England became Great Britain under Queen Anne, the very last Stuart monarch, because she actually declared a permanent union between Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales, right? And so that's why we're going to start calling them Great Britain more often, or Britain and stuff like that, rather than just necessarily saying England, because it's not kind of like a perfectly correct term by this point. And so by 1707, Great Britain, asterisk, is going to be growing rapidly and quickly. That's the other reason why I have an asterisk next to them. It's because, spoiler alert, they're going to win this feud, all right? And they're going to become massive. And by the 1800s, that was going to be a very famous phrase. The sun never sets on the British Empire, right? So something you need to understand about this entire thing is Britain is going to grow very large, very powerful, and very dominant. But how were they able to eliminate the French, and the Dutch, right? Well, a lot of it relates back to colonial wars and feuds, right? So the thing about it is we got problems with this mercantilist theory and mercantilism in general as it's been created, right? It's going to lead to feuds between a lot of different people. And the reason why mercantilism is going to lead to feuds and certain countries rising up and certain countries being more powerful and things like that mostly has to do with the fact that, like, we have a ton of boats flying certain flags, getting all this money and bringing it all in from foreign places like North America, South America, India, and Western Africa, right? You got people like France, the Dutch, the English, all bringing in these goods at the same time. But they're also all being led over by crazy absolutists, right? Except for the Dutch. The Dutch were pretty chill. But, like, you understand what I'm saying? Like, Louis XIV, Oliver Cromwell, the Stuart monarchs, the early ones anyway. Like, so, like, they're going to, like, put these two things together, and what you get is you get wars, right? You get the explosion of conflict that's going to break out, right? And all of this really, truly started with the Navigation Acts. Thanks a lot, Cromwell. You're still ruining everybody's day, all right? So now the thing about it in general, though, is the Navigation Acts that were set down by Cromwell were one of the earliest mercantile acts, right? They're a version of what's known as a mercantile act or a mercantilistic act. The idea that all goods going to and from the colonies must be traded on a British vessel, right? That's a very mercantilistic act because he's trying his best to keep all funds within the British economy, right? Well, the navigation acts are going to anger a very specific group of people because you're limiting their amount of money, right? And that group of people is going to be the Dutch, right? And the Dutch and the English are going to have several wars that break out, right? Towards the end of the Dutch Golden Age, okay? And so eventually their final loss in one of these wars is going to bring it like kind of a closing to the Dutch Golden Age, right? We'll still talk about the Dutch, don't worry. We'll still look at pretty tulips and stuff like that. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is that war is going to break out 3 different times. And they're all called the Anglo-Dutch Wars, right? From 1651 to 1674, they're mostly trade-based and naval wars, okay? And it's going to bring an end to the Dutch Golden Age. At the end of one of these famous wars, the Dutch actually owned a very large colony in North America, and it looked kind of like this. It was right down here off the Isle of Manhattan, and it was literally called New Amsterdam. But after the losing of, after the losing of the Anglo-Dutch War to England, they're going to take this colony and rename it New York, right? So, like, the thing about this entire thing is, just to give you a heads up, is that's why, like, it was called New Amsterdam, and now it's called New York, and it's in that famous song, you know, the Constantinople, Istanbul one. It's a really, really good jam. So the thing about it is I can't put the song in here because I tried earlier, and then it blocked my entire video because YouTube was like, not today. All right, now, the big thing about it, though, in general, okay, how did this happen? The English actually lost the first 2 Anglo-Dutch wars, mainly because they couldn't kind of get any kind of extreme victory in the waters, and there was also this very good Dutch admiral that just kept winning over and over and over and over again and stuff like that. The reason why they were able to win is because they allied with France. Do y'all remember, back when we talked about the Stuarts, Charles II, who's Charles II's famous cousin, Louis XIV? Britain and France allied together under the Stuart monarchy after the Restoration so they could fight the Dutch off and take them out of international trade. And so you're going to begin to see a decline of the Dutch East India Company, and the Netherlands is going to begin to focus more like locally on their local economy rather than the giant international one that's going on. They're still going to have the Dutch East India Company for several years, but it's just not going to be as profitable as it was. And so you'd think after like France and Britain allied together and got together and were like, hey, buddy, so glad that we could fight off those Dutch together, you'd think they'd be like, hey, we can share this water now, right? And Britain just comes in and says, no, get out. Like, so, and what's going to end up happening is these 2 allies are going to turn on each other, right? Because France and Britain are going to become the big new rivals going forward, okay? And the fights and feuds that were had between these 2 groups were mostly over colonial expansion, colonial holdings, and the amount of land that they owned in North and South America, all right? So the thing you need to understand is that this feud is going to get really, really cooked up as well, starting with a couple of different wars in Louis XIV's later life, right? The rivalry, was created mostly due to the fact of one of these famous wars, right? But we got France and Great Britain who are going to square off in 3 wars, starting off with one we've already talked about, that are going to lead to a permanent disunion between the 2 of them and a permanent hatred between the 2 of them. And whoever comes out of these wars alive and whoever wins is going to be the one who dominates the seas, right? Who dominates the seas, who dominates international trade, and will expand to be so large that they're going to be almost impossible to take down, right? I'm sure y'all already know it's going to be this guy, right? So now look, the thing about it though is as well, all right, Sophie Panzavecchia, also channel your inner French, right? Okay, there's your baguette and stuff like that. Now the big thing about it though is round 1 of all these wars, it's going to break the alliance between France and Britain that they had created to take down the Dutch, is going to be the War of Spanish Succession, okay? You know this one already, right? Louis XIV tried to expand in Spain because his grandson was there, you know what I'm talking about? Because, like, it's that whole thing.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa.
That's too damn bad!
Finally. Now, the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at this entire thing, Philip, the grandson of Louis XIV, ends up allowing his grandfather to take possessions of some holdings. The balance of power is tilted, and the rest of Europe got together and allied against France and Spain and beat them in a very massive war that caused huge amounts of debts to France and is going to lead to, be a lead up to their entire French Revolution, right? So the big thing about it, though, I'm tired of this, Grandpa. So the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at this in general, is the the War of Spanish Succession is going to kind of lead to the disloyalty and the hatred of France and Britain with each other, right? But then there's going to be another big war as well, known as the War of Austrian Succession, okay? And the War of Austrian Succession is going to happen between Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa, right? Frederick the Great, all right? Frederick the Great, the Prussian leader, the enlightened despot, really more than anything else, is going to actually invade Austria. Why is he going to invade Austria? Well, he's trying to grow his population. He's going to try and grow the size of his military. He's trying to do a lot of growth in general. But he also feels that Austria is very, very weak at this point. And he thinks this because they have a woman on the throne now, right? And of course, her name is Maria Theresa, right? Maria Theresa, okay, is not weak though, okay? The thing about it in the long run is, did she lose Silesia to the Prussians? She did, okay? So, like, there is Prussia right there. There's the second half of Prussia, and Königsberg is their big city right there. This little bottom area is what Frederick the Great invaded when he doubled their population and stuff like that. That little yellow right there is Silesia, okay? And look at Austria. Austria was massive and very, very large and stuff like that. And as you can see, Great Britain allied with Austria, and France allied with Prussia. Exactly. We got a feud going now because we're picking different sides on this whole thing. But the thing about it is that the war was basically a draw. All that ended up really happening is Prussia is going to gain Silesia, and then what's going to end up going down as well is that the war is going to basically come out to being like, all right, whatever, take that little piece of land or whatever, and they, like, Austria just kind of kept what they had. And Maria Theresa, like I said before, does not need to be invaded, all things considered, because she's a very strong woman. Old girl has 16 kids, all right? So, like, she's a very, very strong, powerful lady, okay? But what's going to end up happening later on, though, is a massive war, right? The big round out of all the rounds was round 3 from 1756 to 1763, the war known as the 7 Years' War, right? You know it locally in the United States as the French and Indian War, okay? So what's going to end up going down is Britain and France are going to flip sides. You saw how Britain was allied with Austria and Prussia was allied with France. Well, what ended up going down is that Britain told Maria Theresa, well, maybe you should just secede. Maybe you should just quit and surrender and allow Frederick the Great to have this land and stuff like that. You have tons of land anyways and stuff like that. And also, you would need to cut your losses while you have them. Well, Maria Theresa is going to be dramatically offended by this. And she's like, you want me to quit this war? You want me to do all this stuff? And she breaks her alliance with Britain. And then, so what ends up happening is France allies with Austria, right? Okay, so France will ally with Austria because they see that the alliance is going the wrong way. Britain, to protect itself, ally with Prussia. And what you can do if you would like is you can drop down into the description below. There's a really good video on like the 7 Years' War and stuff like that in Europe, but it was very, very aggressive. It kind of helps explain all like the different alliances and stuff like that. But Britain and France are going to flip sides. Fun little fact as well, Marie Antoinette was the peace treaty between Austria and France. That's why she ended up becoming Queen of France. But in the long run, this war is going to break out, and it's going to be an inconclusive war in Europe, right? It's going to lead to a heavy amount of death, destruction, and land like loss and stuff like that in Europe. It's also going to lead to the ascension of Catherine the Great, because that was the war that Peter III was fighting against Frederick the Great when he became king, that he just kind of pulled out of, and it pissed off the military, and then like it's going to end up to his overthrow and Catherine taking over, right? It's an inconclusive war in Europe, but it was a knockout punch in the mercantile wars of Britain and France. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that French colonies in North America were very small, right? They only had about 55,000 versus the 1.2 million British people that were living in the colonies in general. That's why it's called the French and Indian War, because the French had to ally with the Native Americans to try and get as many troops and feet on the ground in North America to fight off the British, right? Because look at those numbers. The French only had 55,000 people living in North America against a 1.2 million population of the British colonies, right? Because remember, the British colonies were moving entire families over to North America. Plymouth, Massachusetts, Virginia, the Carolinas, all that stuff. There were entire families that had moved over there for economic gain. But also something you need to understand as well is that there were a handful of battles on land, but there was also a heavy amount of naval engagements in this also, okay? And the French and Indian War, this entire theater broke out because of what is the word I'm looking for? Like territory that wasn't claimed, and some people were like, oh, we own that, and then they were whatever, we won't even get into it. So the thing about it in general, though, is that also, speaking of generals, General George Washington is going to become very famous as a leader during the French and Indian War, but not in the 7 Years' War, because it's not like he's going to go to Europe and fight in that thing. But in this entire thing, we've got France, Russia, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, the Native Americans versus British, Prussia, and the Hanoverians, right? And what ends up going down, though, is in 1763, the Treaty of Paris is going to be like signed, and France is going to lose all of its North American holdings, right? And all of their holdings in India. But we'll review the 7 Years' War and this stuff a little bit more in class. I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all enjoy yourself. I'll see y'all later.